A father's choice. The morning mist clung to the streets of New York as Arthur Lancaster stepped out of his sleek black sedan. The towering buildings around him felt suffocating, but it wasn't the city that troubled him. It was the weight of the decision he had made. A decision that everyone in his world would call reckless, even foolish. Arthur wasn't just any man. He was a self-made millionaire, a tycoon whose name once commanded respect in the world of finance. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but determination and a sharp mind. He had everything: wealth, influence, a luxurious home that overlooked the city skyline. But he had no one to share it with. For years, Arthur had dedicated himself to his work, believing that success was the only thing that mattered. He had watched friends marry, raise families, and talk about their children's accomplishments, while he remained alone, consumed by board meetings and business deals. Now, standing outside the weathered doors of a small orphanage, he realized just how hollow his achievements felt. A deep breath steadied him before he pushed the doors open. The air inside smelled of old wood and warm bread. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere down the hall. A woman in her late 50s, with graying hair and tired but kind eyes, approached him. "Mr. Lancaster?" she asked hesitantly, looking up at him. He nodded. "I called earlier. About the girls." The matron studied him for a moment, skepticism clear on her face. Wealthy men didn't usually show up at places like this, especially not for the reason he had given over the phone. "Yes, of course. Follow me." She led him down a dimly lit corridor, past peeling wallpaper and faded portraits of children who had once lived there. "I have to admit," she said, glancing at him, "I wasn't sure if you'd actually come. People say a lot of things, but they don't always mean them." Arthur didn't respond. He understood. The world was full of empty promises, especially for children who had been abandoned. When they reached the common room, the matron stopped and gestured inside. There they were, 7 girls. They weren't huddled together like in some tragic storybook scene. No, these girls were different. They sat separately, each lost in her own world, yet an invisible thread seemed to tie them together. The oldest, a girl in her mid-teens, stood by the window, arms crossed, staring at the rain-streaked glass. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, as if she had long stopped believing in kindness. Another girl, slightly younger, was sketching something in a notebook, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, her fingers smudged with graphite. Across the room, a pair of identical twins whispered to each other, their matching brown eyes darting toward Arthur suspiciously before they quickly looked away. One girl sat in the corner with a book, her lips moving as she read, oblivious to everything else. Another was humming softly, braiding her own hair with practiced fingers. The last, the youngest, had curled herself into a ball on the worn-out couch, clinging to a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Arthur took in the scene, his heart tightening in a way he wasn't prepared for. "These girls," the matron said softly, "they'd been through a lot. Most of them, well, they weren't picked. Some were returned after failed adoptions. Others never even got a chance." Arthur's gaze swept over them again. He saw something in them, something familiar. Resilience. He knew what it meant to be unwanted. Though he had built an empire, his childhood had been anything but privileged. An abusive father, a mother who had left. Nights spent sleeping in his car before he made his first breakthrough. These girls weren't just strangers. They were him. "Tell me about them," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The matron hesitated, then began. "That's Sophia by the window. She's 15. Sharp as a blade but doesn't trust anyone. She's had to take care of herself for too long." Arthur looked at the girl's rigid posture and nodded. "The one drawing. That's Isabella. She's got a gift, but she's scared to show it. Her last foster home didn't exactly encourage creativity." Arthur's jaw clenched. The twins, Mia and Maya, are inseparable, protective of each other, but wary of everyone else. They've been let down too many times. He saw the way they held on to each other, as if the world could take one away at any moment. That's Lily with the book. Reads everything she can get her hands on. Smart, but quiet. Keeps her emotions locked away. Arthur's gaze softened. He knew the comfort of escaping into words. And Naomi, the one humming. She's always been the mother of the group. Tries to fix everything, even when it's not her responsibility. Arthur exhaled slowly. "And the little one?" he asked, glancing at the youngest, still curled up with her stuffed rabbit. The matron's voice dropped. "That's Evelyn. She's been here the longest. Doesn't talk much, but she's watching. Always watching." Arthur took another long look at them. They had been labeled unwanted, cast aside, forgotten. Not anymore. He turned to the matron. "I want them." She blinked. "Mr. Lancaster, this isn't a business deal. These girls err." "I know exactly what they are," he interrupted gently. "And I know what I'm doing." The matron studied him, searching for deception, but found none. Finally, she sighed. "It won't be easy." Arthur's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. Nothing worth doing ever is. The paperwork took weeks. Meetings with social workers, background checks, home inspections. The media caught wind of it, painting him as everything from a benevolent savior to a billionaire with a secret agenda. Arthur ignored the noise. On a cold December morning, he stood in front of the orphanage once again, this time with adoption papers in hand. The girls stood together, bags packed, staring at him like he was the biggest mystery in the world. "What's the catch?" Sophia asked bluntly. Arthur crouched to their level, meeting each of their gazes. "There is no catch," he said. "You are my daughters now. And I am your father." The room was silent. Then, slowly, something changed. The suspicion didn't disappear overnight. Trust wasn't built in a day. But as they climbed into the waiting car, as they drove toward their new home, a place of warmth, safety, and second chances, Arthur knew one thing for certain. This was the best decision he had ever made. What he didn't know was that 20 years later, these 7 girls would do something even he could never have imagined. Something that would change all their lives forever. Shadows of the past. The city skyline stretched endlessly as Naomi's car weaved through the busy streets. She barely noticed the honking cars, the flashing billboards, or the towering skyscrapers. Her mind was elsewhere, locked on the phone call she had received just hours ago. Arthur Lancaster was dying. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. The last time all 7 of them had been in one place was over 6 years ago, at Sophia's wedding. They had laughed, reminisced, and celebrated. Their father had stood in the front row, beaming with pride. Now, just a handful of years later, he was sick, alone, and penniless. It didn't make sense. Arthur Lancaster was a man who had built an empire. He had given them everything, never asking for anything in return. He had sacrificed his fortune to raise them, walked away from business deals that could have made him even richer, and instead spent his years shaping them into the women they had become. And now he had nothing. Naomi pulled up to the small, single-story house where Arthur now lived. The once powerful man had gone from owning an estate that stretched for acres to a tiny home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The reality of it made her throat tighten. She wasn't the first to arrive. Sophia's car was already parked outside, the sleek black vehicle a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. Inside, she saw Maya and Mia standing by the window, their faces unreadable. Isabella sat on the couch, staring at an old family photo in her hands. Lily, ever the quiet observer, stood near the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of the books their father had once loved. Evelyn, the youngest, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. They had all come back. The door to their father's room was slightly ajar. Naomi hesitated before stepping inside. Arthur lay in bed, his body frail, his once sharp eyes dimmer, but still full of warmth. Despite his weakened state, he managed a smile when he saw her. "My girl," he whispered. She knelt beside him, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Dad, what happened?" Arthur chuckled, though it was weak. "Time happened, Naomi." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't believe that. You were always prepared. You always planned ahead." Arthur exhaled slowly. "I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people." Sophia, standing in the doorway, crossed her arms. "Who did this to you?" Arthur hesitated. Then he spoke a name they all recognized. Victor Greaves. The man who had once been Arthur's most trusted business partner. The man who had betrayed him. The fall of Arthur Lancaster. It had happened gradually. Arthur, always a father first, had taken a step back from business to focus on his daughters. He had entrusted Victor to oversee the company, never imagining the level of deception that would unfold. Victor had siphoned funds, manipulated contracts, and slowly pushed Arthur out. By the time Arthur realized what had happened, it was too late. His name had been smeared, his assets seized, and his reputation ruined. Victor had taken everything. Arthur's company, his wealth, and even his connections. And now, Victor was running for office, using Arthur's stolen fortune to fund his political campaign. The betrayal cut deep. Maya clenched her fists. "He stole from you. From us." Sophia, ever the strategist, was already thinking 10 steps ahead. He didn't just steal from him. He erased him. No one talks about Arthur Lancaster anymore. It's like he never existed. Naomi felt anger bubble in her chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice. Evelyn, quiet until now, finally spoke. "What do we do?" There was a pause. Then Sophia stepped forward. "We take it all back." The oath. The 7 of them stood in the dimly lit living room, the weight of their father's sacrifice pressing down on them. "I won't let him get away with this," Naomi said firmly. "Neither will I," Isabella added, determination flickering in her eyes. Maya and Mia exchanged a look before nodding. "We're in." Lily, always the quietest, simply said, "He needs to pay for what he's done." Evelyn, the youngest but no less fierce, smirked. "Then let's get started." They turned to Arthur, who watched them with tired but proud eyes. "My daughters," he murmured, a faint smile on his lips. "I raised warriors." Sophia knelt beside him, taking his frail hands in hers. "Rest now, Dad. We'll handle this." He nodded weakly. "Just remember, revenge is not the goal. Justice is." They all exchanged glances. For 20 years, Arthur Lancaster had given them everything. He had fought for them, protected them, and made sure they had a future. Now it was their turn. Victor Greaves thought he had buried Arthur Lancaster's legacy. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The plan. The sisters didn't waste time. Within hours of their reunion, they gathered in Naomi's penthouse, sitting around a long glass table in her office. The city lights twinkled outside, but inside, the air was thick with tension. A digital screen on the wall displayed Victor Greaves' face. Smug, confident, the kind of man who had spent his entire life stepping on others to rise to the top. A man who had stolen everything from their father and now stood on the edge of claiming even more power. Sophia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "We have to be smart about this. Victor is powerful. He has money, connections, and an entire campaign behind him. But we have something he doesn't," Naomi said, her eyes sharp. "The truth." Evelyn smirked. "And we know how to use it." Step 1. The paper trail. Sophia took the lead, poring over legal documents late into the night. She knew how men like Victor operated: hidden loopholes, offshore accounts, and shell companies designed to cover his tracks. But she was smarter. With the help of a few trusted allies in the legal world, she uncovered a key detail. Victor hadn't just stolen their father's company. He had falsified records to make it look like Arthur had willingly handed it over. A legal technicality, but a fatal one. "This right here," Sophia said, pointing to the screen as the others leaned in. "If we can prove this was forged, we can undo everything. We can get back what was stolen." Lily, the quietest but most perceptive, studied the document carefully. "If we bring this to the right people, we can start a legal battle." Sophia nodded. "It won't be easy. It'll take time. But this is our foundation." Step 2. The scandal. Evelyn, with her background in journalism, knew exactly how to weaponize the truth. She spent hours digging into Victor's past, reaching out to sources, gathering dirt that had been buried for years. What she found was gold. A former business partner who had been forced out, an employee who had been paid to stay silent, a financial trail leading to offshore accounts that screamed corruption. She worked tirelessly, compiling evidence until she had a full exposé ready to be leaked. "When this goes public," Evelyn said, holding up a flash drive, "Victor's campaign is going to burn." Maya and Mia grinned. "Let's make sure it spreads like wildfire." Step 3. The infiltration. Naomi and Isabella took a different approach. They knew that to destroy Victor, they needed to hit him where it hurt, the people who supported him. Naomi, using her business acumen, reached out to powerful investors, showing them the evidence of Victor's corruption. One by one, they pulled their funding. Isabella, with her connections in the medical world, exposed fraudulent donations Victor had claimed to hospitals, money that had never actually been used for healthcare initiatives. Public trust in Victor Greaves started to waver. Step 4. The takeover. Maya and Mia were the final piece of the puzzle. Their nonprofit work had given them access to people who had been directly harmed by Victor's policies, families who had lost their jobs due to his corporate greed, workers who had been laid off when he took over Arthur's company. They brought these people together. Soon, a movement was born. Social media erupted with stories of how Victor had ruined lives. Protests formed outside his campaign headquarters. His name, once untouchable, became synonymous with scandal. The first strike. 1 week later, the first major news story broke. Breaking news. Victor Greaves, accused of corporate fraud. Evelyn had made sure the exposé landed exactly where it needed to. By the end of the day, Victor's campaign office was flooded with reporters. Investors were pulling out. Allies were distancing themselves. But Victor Greaves was not a man who went down easily. The counterattack. He struck back hard. The next day, headlines flipped. Lancaster sisters on a VNDT. Are they trying to destroy a political candidate out of revenge? Victor's team painted the sisters as bitter, vengeful daughters seeking retribution for their father's downfall. The smear campaign was brutal. Sophia's career as a lawyer was questioned, her past cases put under scrutiny. Naomi's business dealings were attacked, her company accused of unethical practices. Evelyn was threatened, her sources blackmailed into silence. It was a full-scale war. The breaking point. The sisters regrouped. They were battered, but not broken. "We knew he wouldn't go down without a fight," Naomi said, pacing. "We're not giving up now," Isabella added. Sophia exhaled. "We need one final move, something that will end this once and for all." And then Lily, the quiet one, spoke. "I think I know how." All eyes turned to her. She pulled up an old file. "This isn't just about money. It's about power. Victor has spent years hiding behind fake charity work, pretending to be a man of the people. But what if we expose him in a way that can't be denied?" She turned the screen toward them. And there it was. A video. Footage of Victor Greaves, years ago, admitting to framing Arthur Lancaster. A conversation recorded between Victor and one of his closest advisors. Proof that Arthur had been destroyed deliberately, systematically. It had been hidden for years, until now. "This," Lily said softly, "is how we win." The final blow. The video went live the next morning. The effect was immediate. Victor Greaves, caught on camera, boasting about how he had betrayed his former business partner, laughing about how he had manipulated the system. By noon, his campaign was in shambles. His supporters turned against him. His company's stock plummeted. Investigations were launched. By evening, he had resigned from the race. By midnight, he had been arrested. The victory. The Lancaster name was restored. Their father's legacy was no longer tainted. But the sisters didn't stop there. They took back the company, not to hoard wealth, but to rebuild it in their father's honor. They turned it into a foundation dedicated to giving children like them a future. And as Arthur Lancaster, frail but smiling, watched the world finally see the truth, he knew one thing for certain. He had raised warriors, and his legacy would live on through them. The battle. The world had finally seen Victor Greaves for what he truly was: a fraud, a manipulator, and a thief. His political career was over, his empire was crumbling, and his name was forever stained. But the battle was far from over. Victor was not the type of man to accept defeat. As the Lancaster sisters stood victorious in their father's small home, celebrating the first major victory, Sophia's phone rang. When she saw the caller ID, her stomach dropped. It was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A deep, cold voice filled her ear. "You think you've won." Her blood ran cold. Victor. The threat. Sophia put the phone on speaker. The other sisters gathered around, tension thick in the air. "You have no idea what you've just done," Victor continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You might have the public on your side now, but I still have power. I still have influence." Sophia's jaw clenched. Not for long. Victor chuckled darkly. "You think this is over? You and your sisters just made yourselves targets. I hope you're ready for what's coming." The call ended abruptly. A heavy silence filled the room. Evelyn was the first to break it. That sounded like a threat. "It was," Sophia confirmed. Naomi exhaled, pacing. "We expected him to fight back. We need to be ready." Lily, ever observant, studied the expressions of her sisters. "We need to be smart. Victor is desperate. Desperate men make reckless choices." Arthur, sitting in his chair, watching the conversation unfold, finally spoke. "You don't need to fight him with his own weapons." His voice, though weak, held the wisdom they had all grown to depend on. "You don't need to become like him." Sophia knelt by his side. "We won't, Dad, but we have to make sure he can't hurt us, or anyone else, ever again." Arthur's gaze softened. He knew they wouldn't let this go. And a part of him, the father in him, was afraid of what that meant. The counterattack. The sisters didn't waste time. They knew Victor still had resources, hidden accounts, and allies willing to fight for him in the shadows. If he had declared war, they needed to be ready for battle. Step 1. Cutting off his lifeline. Naomi took the lead in freezing his remaining assets. She contacted every bank, every financial institution where Victor had stashed his stolen wealth. With the evidence Sophia had uncovered, she filed injunctions and legal orders, effectively cutting off his money flow. Within days, Victor was left with almost nothing. "You can't fight a war if you don't have an army," Naomi said, satisfied. Step 2. Eliminating his allies. Victor's influence was built on powerful friends, people in government, business, and the media who had helped him rise. But now he was a liability. Evelyn and Maya used their connections to spread more damning information. One by one, his allies abandoned him. Soon, Victor was alone. Step 3. The final exposure. Lily had always been the quiet one, the observer. She noticed things the others didn't. And she noticed something everyone else had overlooked. Victor had more than just financial secrets. He had blood on his hands. Through careful digging, she uncovered records of illegal deals, forced evictions, and even cover-ups involving people who had mysteriously disappeared after crossing him. The final blow came when they found a witness, a former employee who had narrowly escaped one of Victor's business cleanups. Evelyn arranged a televised interview. The world watched as the witness revealed everything. It wasn't just fraud. It was criminal. The moment the story aired, the authorities had no choice but to act. Victor Greaves was arrested. The revenge of the shadows. The night after Victor was taken into custody, Sophia received another call. This time, it wasn't Victor. It was a warning. There are others, a disguised voice whispered. Victor wasn't working alone. He was part of something bigger. You may have cut off the head, but the body still moves. Sophia's grip tightened on the phone. Who are you? A pause. Someone who wants to help. Then the line went dead. Sophia turned to her sisters, her expression grim. This isn't over. The legacy continues. Arthur Lancaster had taught his daughters many things. How to be strong, how to fight for justice, how to build something meaningful. But he had also taught them that battles didn't end just because one enemy had fallen. Now they stood at the edge of something much larger. Victor was gone, but the system that had allowed him to rise still existed. And so, the sisters made a decision. They wouldn't just take back what was stolen from their father. They would make sure no one else could ever suffer the way he had. Sophia restructured the company, ensuring ethical leadership. Naomi created financial programs to help victims of corporate fraud. Isabella used her medical expertise to establish clinics for underserved communities. Maya and Mia expanded their nonprofit to protect children from the system that had failed them. Lily worked behind the scenes, using her knowledge to dismantle corruption at its core. And Evelyn, she continued exposing the truth, one story at a time. They weren't just fighting for Arthur anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. The final conversation. Arthur sat in his chair, watching his daughters as they prepared for the next chapter of their lives. He knew he didn't have much time left, but that was okay. He had done his job. As they stood by his side, he smiled weakly. I don't need my fortune back. I don't need my company. I don't need my name in headlines. He looked at each of them, his voice filled with pride. I have you. And that is the greatest legacy a man could ever leave. A tear slipped down Naomi's cheek. We love you, Dad. Arthur Lancaster took a slow, deep breath. And surrounded by the 7 daughters he had saved, he closed his eyes with a peaceful smile, knowing that his fight was now in the best possible hands. The final war. The day Arthur Lancaster passed away, the world lost a great man, but his legacy had only just begun. His funeral was not just a gathering of family. It was a movement. People whose lives he had touched, directly or indirectly, came forward. Some had once worked under him. Others had been inspired by his principles. Even those who had never met him but had followed the sisters' battle against Victor Greaves attended. It was more than just a farewell. It was a declaration. The Lancaster sisters had won the first battle. But the war was far from over. A shadow emerges. 3 weeks after Victor Greaves' arrest, Sophia received an email. There was no subject line, no sender information, just one sentence. You think you've won. The real war is just beginning. Attached was a list of names, high-ranking officials, business moguls, political figures. And at the top, one name stood out. Marcus Devereaux. Victor had been a monster, but he wasn't the mastermind. There was someone above him, someone far more powerful. The sisters weren't dealing with just one corrupt businessman anymore. They were up against an entire system. The underground fight begins. Naomi took the lead in investigating Marcus Devereaux. He was old money, the kind of billionaire whose name never appeared in the news, but whose influence stretched into every industry. He didn't just control corporations. He controlled politicians, law enforcement, even media narratives. If Victor Greaves had been a cancer on society, Marcus Devereaux was the entire disease. And now he was watching them. The warning. One night, Isabella walked out of the hospital after a long shift, only to find a black car parked outside. A man in a suit stepped out, his expression blank. Miss Lancaster, he said calmly, handing her an envelope. She didn't take it. "Who are you?" "A messenger." She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Walk away, or lose everything you love." Isabella's heart pounded. She knew what this meant. They weren't just threatening the sisters anymore. They were threatening their families, their friends, their future. The decision. The sisters gathered that night in Naomi's penthouse. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. Maya and Mia were the first to speak. "This is bigger than just us," Maya said. "They're trying to scare us," Mia added, "which means we're getting close to something big." Sophia sighed. "But at what cost? They're not just coming after us now. They'll go after our loved ones." Lily, the quietest but wisest of them all, finally spoke. "We don't back down," she said softly. "That's not who Dad raised us to be." Evelyn nodded. "We finish what we started." And so, they made a pact. No matter how dangerous it became, no matter how powerful their enemies were, they would burn the system to the ground. The war begins. Phase 1. The Ghost Files. Evelyn dove into her investigative network, searching for anything that could expose Marcus Devereaux. She uncovered something shocking. A series of offshore accounts, hidden under fake charities, were being used to funnel billions into illegal operations. Human trafficking, black market weapons, bribery of government officials. It was beyond corruption. It was a criminal empire. She compiled everything into what she called the Ghost Files, a dossier so damning that it could bring down half the elite class if leaked. But they needed a way to use it without getting themselves killed. Phase 2. The Inside Man. Naomi had an idea. They needed someone on the inside. Someone in Marcus Devereaux's world who had just as much to lose as they did. After weeks of careful searching, she found him. Daniel Whitmore, Devereaux's former financial advisor. He had once been one of Devereaux's closest allies, but a falling out had left him exiled from the inner circle. He had been in hiding ever since, fearing for his life. Naomi tracked him down in a remote cabin in the mountains. At first, he refused to talk. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he warned. "Marcus doesn't just ruin people. He erases them." But Naomi was relentless. "We're going to take him down," she told him, "with or without you." After hours of persuasion, Daniel finally broke. And what he revealed was worse than they had imagined. Marcus Devereaux had not only framed their father. He had orchestrated Victor's rise to power. He had used Victor as a pawn, knowing that one day he might have to sacrifice him to protect himself. Everything that had happened to Arthur Lancaster, his fall from grace, his loss of fortune, even his illness, had been part of a larger game. A game where Marcus Devereaux always won. Until now. Phase 3. The Grand Exposure. The sisters had everything they needed. The evidence, the insider, the plan. Now, they just had to execute it. They couldn't trust the government. Too many of Devereaux's allies were embedded in the system. They needed to go directly to the people. Evelyn arranged for the Ghost Files to be released in a global exposé, backed by independent journalists who couldn't be bought. Naomi made sure Devereaux's financial crimes were exposed in the business world, sending shockwaves through the economy. Isabella worked with medical organizations to reveal how Devereaux's corruption had affected hospitals and healthcare funding. Maya and Mia led a full-scale social movement, rallying victims who had suffered under his rule. And Lily? Lily made sure that every single person who had ever feared Marcus Devereaux knew one thing. He wasn't untouchable anymore. The fall of a king. When the story broke, it was an earthquake. Governments collapsed. Billion-dollar deals were destroyed overnight. Marcus Devereaux tried to fight back. He sent threats, hired mercenaries. But it was too late. The people he had controlled for decades were turning on him. One by one, his allies abandoned him. And then the final blow came. The FBI, pressured by public outcry, had no choice but to act. Marcus Devereaux was arrested in a dramatic raid, His empire dismantled before his eyes. The Lancaster sisters had done the impossible. They hadn't just avenged their father. They had changed the world. The aftermath. As the dust settled, the sisters stood together, watching the sunset from their father's old estate, the one they had reclaimed. "We did it," Naomi murmured. Sophia nodded. "But this isn't the end." Evelyn smirked. "No, it's just the beginning." They weren't just Arthur Lancaster's daughters anymore. They were warriors, and they had just won the biggest war of their lives. But as they stood there, the wind carrying whispers of their past and future, Lily spoke one final warning. "The world isn't just full of men like Marcus," she said softly. "There are others." Sophia exhaled. "Then we keep fighting." Because that's what they had always done. And that's what they would always do. The legacy of the Lancaster sisters. 1 year later, the world had changed. Marcus Devereux was behind bars, his empire shattered. Victor Greaves had become nothing more than a cautionary tale, his name erased from history. The corruption that had once seemed untouchable had been exposed, dismantled, and burned to the ground. And yet, the battle was far from over. The Lancaster sisters had won a war, but they had also painted a target on their backs. They had made enemies, powerful, silent, unseen enemies who thrived in the darkness. Sophia knew it. She could feel it in the air, in the way her phone calls were sometimes mysteriously disconnected, in the subtle threats that still surfaced in the shadows. Naomi knew it too. Her company had been hit with multiple anonymous legal attacks, lawsuits meant to tie her up in court for years. They had all been thrown out, but the message was clear. Someone was still watching. Evelyn had received death threats. Lily had been followed. Maya and Mia's nonprofit had been hacked, their records nearly erased. They had defeated a king, but the game wasn't over. The board had just reset. A new purpose. Sophia sat in the old Lancaster estate, the house they had reclaimed, restored, and turned into something greater. It was no longer just a home. It was a command center. The Lancaster Foundation had been officially launched, an organization dedicated to exposing corruption, funding orphanages, and giving voices to those who had been silenced by the powerful. But beneath that noble mission, there was something else. A network, a silent, unstoppable force, run by 7 women who had seen the worst of the world and refused to let it win. They weren't just fighting one man anymore. They were dismantling an entire system, and they weren't doing it alone. The gathering of allies. The sisters knew they couldn't fight this battle by themselves. They needed others, people who believed in their cause, who had suffered under the weight of corruption and power. They called on everyone they had helped. The journalists who had risked their careers to publish the ghost files, the whistleblowers who had come forward, the families who had lost everything under men like Marcus Devereux. A network formed, spanning industries and countries. And at its core, the Lancaster sisters led the charge. The first strike. Their first mission came sooner than expected. A young woman, barely in her 20s, showed up at their doorstep. Her name was Alina, and she was terrified. "My father was murdered," she whispered, and they covered it up. Her father had been a financial investigator, looking into offshore accounts tied to some of the most powerful figures in the world. Before he could release his findings, he had a sudden accident. The sisters knew exactly what that meant. Someone had silenced him, and now they were trying to silence his daughter. The hunt begins. Evelyn took the lead, digging into the files Alina's father had left behind. It didn't take long to find the truth. A network of secret investments, hidden by layers of false names and ghost companies, money moving from criminal organizations into legitimate businesses, laundering billions under the noses of regulators. And at the center of it all, a name they recognized. Not Marcus Devereux, not Victor Greaves, someone even higher. A name that had never been exposed. A name so protected that even whispering it in the wrong places could get you killed. Sophia's heart pounded as she stared at the screen. This This is bigger than anything we've ever faced. Lily, standing behind her, murmured, "And if we go after them, there's no turning back." The room fell silent. And then Naomi spoke. "We go after them." There was no hesitation, no fear, because they were Lancaster sisters, and they had never backed down from a fight. The final war begins. This time, there would be no courts, no headlines, no legal battles. This was a war fought in the shadows, with allies who knew how to disappear, with enemies who had spent their entire lives building walls around themselves. But the Lancaster sisters had spent their entire lives learning how to break down walls, and they were just getting started. The last conversation with their father, before Arthur Lancaster had passed, he had told them one thing: never let fear decide who you are. They hadn't. And now, as they stood together, preparing for the next battle, they knew one thing for certain. Their father's legacy wasn't just his name. It was them. And as long as they were standing, they would fight. Not for revenge, not for power, but for justice. And this time, they weren't just going after the man at the top. They were going after everything he built. And they weren't stopping until it all burned to the ground. The beginning of the end. The Lancaster sisters had spent a year dismantling corruption piece by piece. They had torn down the legacy of Victor Greaves. They had exposed Marcus Devereux and sent him to prison. They had built a network of allies willing to fight the war that no one else dared to wage. But now, standing on the edge of something even bigger, they realized they were not just fighting one man. They were fighting an entire hidden empire, a shadow government, a secret council of the world's most powerful elites. And this time, the enemy wasn't just watching them. They were coming for them. The Vanishing Act. 3 months after their war on corruption escalated, Naomi disappeared. It happened so suddenly that none of them saw it coming. One moment, she was in a meeting with international investors for the Lancaster Foundation. The next, her phone was disconnected, her emails wiped, and her GPS signal erased. No ransom note, no sign of a struggle, no clue where she had gone. Sophia, Evelyn, Isabella, Lily, Maya, and Maya stood in the war room of their estate, staring at the blank screen where Naomi's location should have been. "She wouldn't just vanish," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "Not without telling us." Sophia clenched her fists. "They took her." Lily nodded. "And they want us to know it." The message was clear. Back down, or lose everything. But if their enemies thought they would break, they had made a fatal mistake. The Lancaster sisters didn't back down. They hunted. The chase. Evelyn used her connections in the media to search for any sign of Naomi's whereabouts. Maya and Mia activated the underground network of whistleblowers and insiders they had built. Isabella reached out to law enforcement contacts, knowing full well that many would be too scared to help. And then Lily did what she did best. She found the untraceable. After 2 weeks of digging through encrypted files and offshore transactions, she found the first breadcrumb, a hidden flight manifest. Naomi had been on a private jet, taken out of the country under a false identity. Destination: an unknown location in Eastern Europe. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But they had underestimated the Lancaster sisters, the silent fortress. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Naomi hadn't just been kidnapped. She had been taken to a facility, a place where people disappeared, never to be seen again. A private compound, owned by an unnamed entity, rumored to be a hub for illicit global activities, the kind of place where threats weren't just silenced. They were erased. Sophia exhaled, staring at the satellite images Lily had pulled up. It's a fortress, a heavily guarded perimeter, armed security, no official records of ownership. This wasn't just a hidden prison. It was a graveyard for those who knew too much. And Naomi was trapped inside. Maya, always the impulsive one, slammed her fist on the table. "Then we break in." Sophia nodded. "Yes, but we don't just get Naomi out." Evelyn smirked. We burned the whole place to the ground. The infiltration. The sisters spent the next 3 weeks planning. They weren't just fighting corrupt businessmen anymore. They were up against mercenaries, trained killers, and a network of elites who had built their empires on secrecy and fear. But the Lancaster sisters had spent their lives fighting against impossible odds. They had grown up as orphans in a world that didn't want them. They had been underestimated, discarded, overlooked. Now, they were the storm coming for those who thought they were untouchable. The night of fire. On a cold, moonless night, the sisters made their move. They arrived at the hidden compound in disguise, posing as high-ranking executives attending an exclusive gathering. Maya and Mia handled the infiltration, taking down guards with precision and speed. Isabella accessed the medical records of the facility, uncovering its true purpose: human trafficking, political blackmail, experimental torture. Evelyn hacked into the security system, looping the cameras while Sophia led the team deeper inside. And Lily? Lily found Naomi first. She was in a cold, dimly lit cell, her wrists bruised from restraints, but her eyes were full of fire. "I knew you'd come," Naomi whispered. Lily smirked. Of course. But their enemies weren't going to let them leave so easily. Alarms blared. Doors slammed shut. Gunfire erupted. The Lancaster sisters had walked into the belly of the beast. But they weren't trapped inside with their enemies. Their enemies were trapped inside with them. The fall of the hidden empire. The compound was burning. Maya and Mia had rigged explosives, setting off controlled detonations as they fought their way out. Isabella helped the prisoners escape, dozens of people who had been locked away, waiting to die. Evelyn uploaded everything, every secret file, every transaction, every crime, onto a live broadcast. The world was watching as the shadows were dragged into the light. And in the chaos, Marcus de Verrox's true master was revealed. A man whose name had never been spoken. A billionaire puppeteer who had shaped world events for decades. He stood before them, watching his empire collapse, his face twisted with fury. "You don't know what you've done," he seethed. "This world needs men like me." Sophia leveled her gaze at him. "No," she said, "this world needs men like our father." And with that, they walked away as the final explosion turned the fortress of corruption into rubble. The new order. The Lancaster sisters didn't just win. They changed the rules of the game. Their enemies were exposed. Their father's legacy was restored. But more importantly, they had built something new. A world where no one had to fight alone. Where truth couldn't be silenced. Where power was no longer protected by shadows. They weren't just 7 unwanted girls anymore. They were the reckoning. And they weren't done yet. The final chapter, or the next beginning. As they stood together, watching the sunrise over a world they had helped reshape, Naomi turned to her sisters. "What now?" Sophia smiled. "Now, we find the next battle. Because as long as corruption existed, as long as there were people who thought they could silence the truth, the Lancaster sisters would be there. Fighting, winning, and proving, once and for all, that the world could be changed. Because they were the daughters of Arthur Lancaster, and his legacy would never die.